Hey guys, welcome back to Advanced Bass Fishing, and appreciate you guys joining me for today's episode. And guys, today I'm going to talk about rods a little bit, and I want to talk about rod stiffness or rod softness. In other words, specifically the end of your rod, as far as how easy it bends or how stiff it is like this. This part of a rod right here, guys, is so critical to landing and getting a good hook set in the fish and actually getting the fish in the boat. And there's a lot of sort of like, I don't say misinformation, but I think a lot of people don't really understand the feature or what the rod stiffness means in terms of how you need to pick one or choose one or how you need to operate within it. So we're going to have a good conversation on rod stiffness, and I think it's going to really help you guys to be able to pick out the right rod for your own fishing. Also, guys, for get started, speaking of rods, guys, I will put my Megabass Levante rod link in the description of this video and my Tackle Warehouse link. Megabass makes some of the finest rods anywhere in the world. And this Levante series, the one that I use primarily, this rod is under $200. The attention to detail and the components are second to none. You guys will love this rod. And they've got every action available. So if you're interested in purchasing a rod, guys, I'll have the Levante link in the description of this video if you guys would like to check that out. So appreciate it. Okay, guys, when you're talking about rod, I'm not really focusing this much on the butt section, the stiffness of the butt section, and I want to talk about the stiffness of the rod. Now, there's a lot of rod snobs out there, guys. Every time I do a rod video, there's always some dudes come in there say I'm using the wrong terminology and it's power and action and this and that. I don't care about any of that. I'm just talking about a basic, just a common sense measure of how stiff your rod tip is. Is it stiff? Is it not stiff? How much does it bend? How much does it flex? Whatever. So let's talk a little bit about why you need to consider that and why it's important to consider how stiff your rod is. It has everything to do with the lure and the technique that you're fishing. Not only the lure and the technique, but it has a little bit to do with the line size and the type of cover that you're fishing in terms of what you need here. Now let's sort of go through the entire features of it in terms of a rod that has a real soft tip. In other words, a rod that bends real easy, whippy tip, we used to call them whippy tips, or a real stiff rod that we used to call broomsticks. So you've got a broomstick on one end that's got a super stiff rod, and you've got a whippy tip that's got like a little noodle on the other end. And then like on the Levante Megabass series, you have a bunch of different other tip actions that are sort of in between there. They're, come to the middle of that. Now, this is what you have to consider. First of all, you want to always try to use the rod that has the softest or the whippiest tip that you can get away with. Because here's the thing about it, overall anything else. Once you do hook that fish, assuming that you do get a hook in the fish and you're fighting that fish, you're gonna land a lot more bass if you have a rod that has a very soft tip on it, because you have that give to it and that flex to it. If a fish makes a run or pulls in a certain direction, a soft tip rod is really forgiving. And if you have a stiff tip rod, like a broomstick we're talking about, you don't have that. You don't have any flex or any give. It's the same like grabbing the line or something. When you grab the line and try to pull the fish in with your hand, you'll lose the fish a lot of times because there's no give in it. So given that, you always want to try to use the softest tip that you can, but you've got to be able to manipulate the lure that you're using. You've got to be able to set the hook to get a hook in the fish, and you've got to be able to get the fish out of the cover. So all that determines how stiff the tip that you need, and also the weight of your lure determines the stiffness of it. Obviously, the heavier bait that you use, if you use like a big heavy lure, like a 1 ounce spinner bait or a 1 ounce jig or a 1 ounce or 2 ounce swim bait or glide bait, you're going to have a stiffer tip rod to make the cast with a heavy lure like that. And on the other end of the spectrum, if you're using, thing flies in here, if you're using a light lure, like something like a 1/4 ounce lure or 3/16 ounce lure, you simply can't cast it very good with a stiff tip, so you have to have a softer tip. Another consideration to make with it is the type of hook that you're using and the diameter of the hook you're using. If you're using a thicker hook, especially a single hook that requires you to actually set the hook to force that hook into the fish's mouth, you're going to have a stiffer tip, because you cannot get a larger diameter, bigger barbed hook into a fish's mouth and penetrate the mouth with a softer tip. So you have to use a little bit stiffer tip. And on the other end of the spectrum, if you're using a little wire hook, like you got a little small jerk bait or a little small crankbait, you always want to use the softer tip, simply because it's not going to bend that hook out, and you don't need that power for to drive that hook through. The small diameter doesn't require much force with that. So in between there, you sort of have to learn what rod actions you need. If you lay out all the lure selections that you have, let's say that you got your lure weights ranging from an 1/8 ounce all the way up to 2 ounces, you need to have a rod line that handles all those. For your big heavy baits, you need to have a stiff rod, like a flipping stick. For your smaller baits, you need to have a softer tip spinning rod. And when you look in the like the Megabass directory on there, you'll have there's a thing that says power on it. Like, it says like, F1 or P1 or whatever like that. The higher the number, the stiffer the rod is. So if you look at that Megabass description in that Tackle Warehouse video, if you see a rod that has like a 1 power or a 2 power, it's a pretty soft tip on it. And if you get something that has like a 6 or 7 or 8 power, you're going to have a pretty stiff, rod on it. So in general, the lures that I use a soft tip on, like the whippy soft tips, are things like small crankbaits, drop shots, like a Ned rig, something that has a small hook on it, anything that has a small hook. The medium power, let's say for example, if you have a 1 power that is a real whippy rod, and you got a 10 power that's a broomstick, like the number 5 power would be something that I would use like maybe for a medium running crankbait that has number 4 hooks on it, or something like a 3/8 ounce spinner bait, or maybe a chatter bait, or something like a Texas rig Cinco, something along those lines. Some type of a bait range in that 1/4 ounce to 1/2 ounce range. And then as my hook diameter and my bait gets larger, so is my stiffness and the power on my rod. So anyway, guys, that's just sort of a basic foundation as far as rod selection, as far as the action on them. And I can't say that you need to have a whippy rod because it's easier to land the fish. You got to have the appropriate rod for what you need. And if you want to keep it simple and you don't want to spend a ton of money, guys, get a rod that has, like in the Megabass line, get like something that's got a 3 power, a 5 power, and then maybe a 7 or 8 power. And those 3 rods right there will allow you to fish a diversity of different type of baits. So anyway, I hope it helps you guys out. We'll talk later.